Sounds good. Hang on a second. Oh.
Hi. Am I like logged in?
I was like, why can't I control this?
Oh, I think I must have accidentally been logged in from like the last time I used Zoom.
Yeah, that's okay. Who are you logged in as right now?
Greenpeace volunteer, I think.
Weird. So am I. Okay, I'm gonna log in under my own. Well, I guess actually,
you don't need it.
Off.
I don't know.
Chat. Okay. Well, it isn't impacting me. So the only thing I would say is if you could pause recording until we get started.
Oh, I didn't realize that it was.
Thank you. Okay, great. We're live. We're recording. Welcome. Give me just a second. Cool. Wonderful. So tonight, Hannah is going to be graciously sharing her screen with us so that we can follow along in a PowerPoint. And don't worry about taking notes. The PowerPoint will also be sent out to you afterwards. So no sweat if for some reason you can't. And actually, Hannah, while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and respond because I'm getting some questions on our Discord channel about this very training. So give me just 1 second.
Okay. Could folks make sure that they're on mute? It just makes it a little easier.
Welcome to the program here. I'm going to pick up Kathy's conversation.
And Hannah, just so you know, you can also hit the mute everyone button on Zoom to prevent some of that as well.
To say the things that she said to me, and I'm glad that she called. Let me start.
Where is this button?
Let me start here.
So folks, there is a mute button at the bottom of your screen, and if you haven't yet accessed it, go ahead and hit it.
I'll have a story.
Cool. Great. Awesome. So while Hannah's sharing her screen, sorry about that, technical difficulties, we plan for this every single time. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this into a separate program that we're using that we'll get to in just a minute. And her screen. Okay, ready to rock. Wonderful. Thanks again, y'all, for your patience. We're using Zoom, which has some technical challenges, just like all technology. So to that effect, I'm going to take just a minute to introduce you to some of the functions in Zoom. So Hannah, you can click on the next slide. Ooh, fancy animation. So here's the tools that you'll need to know. One we've discovered already is the mute and the unmute button. So if you want to talk or you have a thought to share with us, you can unmute yourself. You can also, for instance, if you've got something weird happening in your background, you can also stop your own video presentation. So you don't have to see what's going on if you don't want to. And then additionally, the two things that you want to click are participants and chat. And once you click both of those, you'll be able to see the group chat, which I'm going to type in something right now. Welcome, everyone. Exclamation point. And then you can see that. So we'll have some opportunities for you to interact that way as well. So you don't have to come off mute. Perfect. And if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to text me. My phone number is in the email that I sent to you. So, wonderful. So with that, I'll introduce myself. Yes, I'll introduce myself. I am Peter Dakota, and I just got married last week, and I realized that I put my wrong name on here. But I'm Peter Dakota Spencer McElhatton, and I work at Greenpeace. I live here in I live in Oakland, California, which is occupied Ohlone territory. But right now I'm actually in Portland, Oregon, which is the historical territory of Multnomah folks. And at Greenpeace, I get to do trainings like this. Basically, I work on training supporters in different ways to organize and be more effective in their campaigns. I've been with Greenpeace just shy of a year. And before that, I was doing organizing mostly in LGBTQ communities of color, and Indigenous communities, and in Oregon mostly. With that, I'll kick it over to Hannah to introduce yourself.
Hello. I don't think I'm on mute. Can y'all hear me? Perfect. I'm Hannah. I am a Summer of Resistance organizer based in DC. We will get into what Summer of Resistance is, but it is Greenpeace's project for the summer, training folks in nonviolent direct action and helping people do grassroots organizing in their community and creating local acts of creative resistance wherever they may be. So I'm really excited to be helping Peter out with this training. I think grassroots organizing is just so important. And yeah, like I said, I'm really excited to be talking with y'all today. I'm originally from Louisiana, a suburb of New Orleans. But like I said, now I'm in DC. And I use she, her pronouns.
Awesome. That is a great segue because I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves. And I'm going to ask you to introduce your name and your gender pronoun. And one reason why we share gender pronouns here at Greenpeace and in organizing is because one way that we can make this space inclusive and affirming of our transgender, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, and two-spirit folks who are in this movement is to just share our pronouns, and you can use them in a respectful way to refer to someone just like you would your name. So for instance, I'm Peter Dakota Spencer McElhatton, and I use he, his, and him pronouns. Some examples of pronouns that you might use are she and her, he, his, him, they, them, theirs, or your name. It's always a good pronoun. And if you're not sure, feel free to just ask someone or use their name. And lucky for us, we have technology, and you can usually see someone's name, so you can just refer to them by their name. Wonderful. So I'm going to ask you to share your name, your pronoun, where you are, and if there's any particular issues that you work on or what you're passionate about, go ahead and share that. And you can do that in the chat box. So feel free to type that in there, and I will wait. Cool. We got Chuck on the line. Welcome, Chuck. Bobby, welcome. Cool. So far we have Chuck, who is passionate about climate change and recognizing it as a threat. And Bobby in Las Vegas, talking about national parks being a key issue. I'll give folks another minute to drop things in there.
Hello.
Hey.
Can you guys hear me? Can you see me?
Yeah, we can hear and see you.
Okay, cool. So my name's Maribel, and I'm also from Las Vegas. That's pretty cool. Someone signed in from Vegas as well. I do mainly, I facilitate women's circles, and I just do a little bit of community organizing as far as like putting events together like at parks, to bring just cultural like arts and music to people. And yeah, right now my focus is on women's empowerment and circles and all that. And so I'm wanting to see what I can get from this webinar today, which thank you so much for putting it together and sharing it with us.
Great, thank you and welcome.
Thank
Cool,
you.
well folks can continue sharing in that chat box as I sort of talk a little bit about Greenpeace real quickly. So feel free to keep checking back there and see what you find. So a little bit about Greenpeace. Greenpeace, I imagine many of you are familiar with it, but Greenpeace is essentially the leading independent campaigning organization that uses peaceful protest, creative communication to expose global environmental problems and promote solutions that are central to a green and peaceful future. So as you can see, I highlighted a couple of really important words that I find in that. One is that we're independent. Right? So we are not tied to a particular government agency. We're not tied to a business. And we make sure that we're not taking money from those entities so that we can do the work that we need to do. Peaceful protest. Greenpeace has a long history of nonviolent direct action and peaceful protest, which is how we're able to achieve so many of our goals. We harness people power and peacefully rise up when we see injustice. And creative communication. We have a sense of humor about just about everything except for issues of justice. And we aren't afraid to get creative in the ways that we communicate to decision makers about the different issues that we're facing. And right now we're working on a few different things. We are launching Full On the Summer of Resistance, which is a series of distributed events where folks like you create different events and really tailor them to your home community to resist attacks on clean air and clean water and hateful Trump agendas and hateful policies that are coming out of the government right now. We have our Clear Skies campaign, which is basically working on stopping fossil fuel infrastructure, new build-outs of those, and helping protect communities that way. And we are also right now working we also actually just closed out one of our campaigns, Resolute, which is basically fighting a lawsuit against Greenpeace, which is basically threatening to have a chilling effect on some of the freedom of speech and the peaceful protests that we can do. So that's a little bit about Greenpeace. Thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself. I just saw someone said, I heart Greenpeace, and I'm just gonna go ahead and speak for Greenpeace right now and say, we heart you too. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda. Ooh, fancy. So tonight we're going to be doing a couple things. As you know, this is Organizing 201. So we're going to be digging a little bit deeper on some of the concepts that we cover initially in our Organizing 101. But we know that you all probably have lots to share. So if at any point you have a question, you have a thought, you have something to add, you can drop it in that chat box and I'll call it out and I'll stop the thing and we can talk about it. Or feel free to raise your hand if I can see you. So tonight we're going to be talking about selecting strong issues. We're going to talk about kind of like why community organizing, or excuse me, I should say grassroots organizing, like why we select the issues that we do and why they work. We're going to talk about a couple different methods for developing strategies and tactics, and then some of the ways that you can actually use these in different campaigns. Perfect. So if we have no other thoughts, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Hannah to talk about grassroots organizing and kind of just give us a brief overview.
All right, thank you, Peter. So what is grassroots organizing? Just simply put, it's organizing itself is tapping into the potential of ordinary people to make change. And so grassroots organizing is organizing folks that are most directly impacted and involved in the issue first, and then building our network up from the bottom. So this happens when individuals gather to identify problems and possible solutions. And then they harness their collective power as a group to influence key decision makers with the goal of making change happen. So there's a lot in that. Again, like the important thing to remember is that this is grassroots organizing. And so it's called grassroots because the demand and the movement for change starts at the bottom, or starts with the people and the public, as opposed to, say, like grass tops organizing. So that is when change is kind of like top down. So these decision makers make a decision and then it kind of affects the rest of the people. But grassroots is when people gather and say, you know, we see an issue and we want to make change, so we're going to work together to make that happen from the bottom up. And so, yeah, as far as identifying a, well, let's go over this first. So organizing, again, is just leveraging the power to make regular people make change for the better. And the grassroots level of organizing is the most local and people-centric. And I think that's really important, being local and people-centric. Just, yeah, harnessing that people power that already exists in your community and just using it to really make change happen. And so as far as how to identify a grassroots opportunity, any place that there's an injustice, there is an opportunity to organize. But the question is, what do you need to make a grassroots campaign really powerful? And the answer is people. You really need people to make a campaign powerful. And so by selecting an issue that really speaks to the people, you can seize that opportunity to make change happen. And so a lot of this is done in the way that you frame an issue. I can't remember if there is a slide for this.
Well, sure. It's the blank slide.
Yeah. All right. So this is where we talk about issue framing.
Oh, sorry.
Great. So again, it's really vital to frame whatever issue you're working on in a way that compels people to care about your issue, and then furthermore to want to take action in regards to whatever issue that you're focusing on. And so issues gain a lot of momentum when they have some themes. So the first theme is issues really gain momentum when they are widely felt. So when an issue can kind of be shared by a lot of people. So an example that I thought of is like freedom of speech. Like everything kind of seems polarizing right now, and especially in our political climate. But typically, if you ask like a reasonable person, do you think we should have freedom of speech, freedom of thought? Most people will say yes. And so if the issue that you're working on isn't something that impacts a wide audience of people, it's hard for people to relate to that issue. And people tend not to care as much about issues when they cannot clearly connect the issue that you're talking about to their reality and to their everyday lives. And so it makes your campaign easier when a lot of people are invested in your issue. The second theme that we see in issues that gain a lot of momentum very easily are issues that are deeply felt. So instead of being widely felt, they're deeply felt. The example that I thought of was like the SPCA commercials of like the really sad animals. Like you're just so moved by compassion for like these vulnerable animals, and you want to take action even though there's not like a direct link like to the animal on your screen to your life. But you feel it very deeply because of the way that it's marketed and the way that it's framed to you. And so you become invested in this campaign and, you know, the target's well-being. And so if the issue isn't something that's impactful enough for folks to spend their time and energy on, it's really unlikely to move people to take action. And so if your issue doesn't impact many people, so if it's not widely felt, it's really key to highlight how it's deeply felt, if possible. So ideally, the issue that you're working on is both. It's widely felt and it's deeply felt. Obviously, sometimes it's both, sometimes it's one or the other, sometimes it's neither. And so that's why it's really important to think of storytelling in grassroots organizing and how you build your narrative around your issue that you're working on. And if you can tell a story, you can really make people care. You can make people empathize with your issue, then it's more likely that you're going to gain a lot more momentum if people feel compelled to take action. And you can do this by either showing them how an issue actually affects them, even if they think that it doesn't, or by showing them that, you know, they should care, that, you know, making them feel an emotional attachment or some kind of connection to your issue. And so an example that I just wanted to talk about that I think a lot of people are really interested in on this call is climate change. And so just giving like a very personal example, for me, like climate change was always something that was very removed from my life. It seemed very abstract. Like I knew that the world was warming up, but I didn't really get how it impacted me. But then I really thought about like the stories behind like what climate change is doing to our environment and also to it's like our people and our communities. So like I said at the beginning of the call, I was raised in Southern Louisiana. And so like my mother speaks French. I come from a very Cajun family. And Cajun people, it's a very like small community in Southern Louisiana that speak French. You've probably heard of like Cajun food and Zydeco music and all of that. But Louisiana loses a football field's worth of land every hour due to coastal erosion, due to rising sea levels, severe weather patterns, storms. And so we're losing like all of this land that these communities are really based in. And yeah, like my heritage and my cultural roots are really disappearing because of climate change. And so just seeing how like this community is literally disappearing off the face of the earth because of climate change, which is this abstract ideal. But, you know, I was able to see how it has very real implications in my life and a lot of people's lives. Like there are stories like this everywhere. It's definitely not just Southern Louisiana that climate change is impacting. So really focusing on the narrative and being able to tell a story about your issue, I think really helps advance your campaign. So with that, if I can get this to move, here we go. I'm gonna pass it to Peter to talk about next steps.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just to add on to that for a moment, I think like in addition to being able to tell stories, it's so important to talk to your community, because if you're not sure what issues are widely or deeply felt in your community, then it's really difficult to get people to join you. And sometimes even if you know, like talking to your community or other groups in your community can be a good way to talk about how you should be framing it or what stories you should be telling. Because as of course, you know, your own personal experience isn't always necessarily shared by everyone, unfortunately. And just because we're talking about, you know, sort of like change from the bottom up, it doesn't mean we aren't talking about changing systems, because we very much are. We are talking about, you know, using people power to shift the different systems and mechanisms in our society rather than making shifts just within one person. But that oftentimes happens best when we can all come together and make that happen together. So again, just to sort of like continue the review from our 101 presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about goal strategies and tactics, because these are words that we often use, but it can be really useful for all of us to kind of have a common understanding of what that means. So a goal is, of course, something, as you might expect, that we're talking about in the future, right? The question you want to ask yourself is, how far in the future is my goal, right? Like, is it next week? Is it 10 years from now? Is it 20 years from now? And this is really your opportunity to dream big, right? So instead of thinking like, what if everyone drove an electric car? You might think, what if we didn't need cars to get around in the world, right? So your goal is what you want. And your goal is going to inform your strategy. Your strategy is how you're going to get to your goal. And that might seem really intuitive, but sometimes these two things don't always sync up. Like you might say, yeah, I want to, you know, talk about a campaign for clean water, but you are, for instance, lobbying a government organization that doesn't necessarily have control over water. Or conversely, you're not engaging the people who might be most impacted by a clean water issue, right? So making sure that your goal is really linked to your strategy is very important. And lastly, this is your tactic. So your tactics those are just tasks that you take to advance your strategy, right? Now, this is the one that we really see. We oftentimes like sort of like get our impression of a particular campaign because we actually see someone deploying a tactic. And so it can be easy to think, oh, that's the campaign when they shut down the freeway or when they occupy the senator's office. But the reality is that's not the campaign. That's just one thing they're doing to make sure that they're solving an issue. Does that kind of make sense? Cool. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about the second piece of this, and that's forming your strategy. And the strategy, again, is sometimes the most important thing because it's actually sort of like the vessel to get you to your goal, right? Go ahead and hit next slide. Cool. And the first thing we're going to talk about is power mapping, right? And just out of curiosity, I can't see everyone's hands, but feel free to drop in the chat box. Have y'all like heard of power mapping before? Have you used power mapping? Are you familiar with it? Cool. Chuck, thank you. Chuck will be our resident expert for the evening. Awesome. Cool. So folks have used power mapping before, and there's a lot of different ways to use power mapping. And we're going to talk about mostly using it to sort of help us identify a decision maker and help us clarify our strategy a little bit. But you can use it, of course, to identify who has the power to make decisions. You can figure out kind of like what people, places, or things a decision maker cares about. So like how you can leverage or gain leverage on your decision maker to make it more compelling for them to listen to you. You can also figure out like sort of where people sit along this spectrum of, you know, being in agreement with you or being in opposition to you, and figure out how you can move someone along that spectrum. You can map support for a particular goal. So sometimes, you know, talking about that widely and deeply felt thing, you can see, do people in the community, are they likely to care about this particular issue? You can identify people who you should team up with, and really you can use this as in 1,000 more different ways that I haven't even thought of, or maybe haven't been done before, because it's a really versatile tool. So let's chat a little bit about the different formats. Again, just like you can use power mapping in a bunch of different ways, there's a lot of different kinds of power maps that people do. These are two ways that I personally use, and that Greenpeace, we use at Greenpeace all the time. But again, you might have some others that you're familiar with. So one, I believe it should be on the right-hand side, is kind of the typical grid format, right? And at the top, you have like sort of like people who have either the most influence or no influence at all. And then on the left-hand side, you have people who are with us, or they're in agreement with the social change. And on the right-hand side, you have people who are very much opposed to social change or against what we're hoping for, right? And you could plot people along that line in either direction. On the left-hand side, it's a little bit more different, and it's a little bit more word heavy. So if you're somebody who's really good at like verbal processing, or you like to write a lot, this would be a great one for you. But once you've kind of identified who it is you need to go after, or who your decision maker is, right? Who can give you what you want, you can then start mapping out like, who do they care about? What do they care about? And the different ways and the different sort of spheres of their life that you can use to apply pressure on them. So on the one side, it's a little bit more mapped out, and it's a little bit more about the whole picture. And on the left-hand side, it's more about the specific decision maker that you have. Does that make sense? Oh, awesome. Janice is saying we use power mapping in Jewish Voice for Peace and did a webinar to explain it, and I missed that session. So yay, I will preach. Yeah, and Janice, if you have any additions to this or thoughts or provocations, please feel free, because I would love to do a whole webinar on power mapping. It is an essential tool. So let's look at a little real-time example. Cool. So the example that I used is just something that I've been working on lately. Oh no, it's populating. You're not supposed to populate yet. That's okay. That's all right. Perfect. So the example that I'm using is a city investing in fossil fuel banks. So let's take, for instance, the city of Oakland. I don't know, maybe I have a personal connection there. Yeah, so the city of Oakland, for instance, is banking, like both invests with and has their money tied up with a bank that is also directly funding fossil fuel projects like pipelines, for instance, right? And so if I were thinking, okay, I want to stop that from happening, and I want my city council to be doing that, or my city to be doing that, I might map out the different players in this. As you can see, so this thicker line here, that is really how with us or how against us someone is, right? So on the right-hand side, you can see the bank CEO. I bet you can probably guess that person isn't really with us on this particular issue. And on the left-hand side is somebody who is like absolutely other community groups. And then the slightly thinner line down the middle, that is how much influence someone has. So up at the top might be, for instance, the last yeah, the last person that isn't on there is at the top. So that might be the mayor, for instance. And at the bottom, it might be somebody who is just an isolated individual and doesn't have any influence in this, right? So as you can see over here on the right, over here on the right, I've placed the city council. And the reason why is because the city council can make decisions like that, right? And we'll say that this particular city council maybe has some ties to the fossil fuel industry. They're not super into what we're doing. On the other hand, we have the voters, and the voters can very much impact those people. So they have a little bit more power in this particular situation, and it's a relatively progressive town. And let's say they are absolutely, or they're mostly with us on this issue, right? For the most part. Over here on the far left, of course, you have like local environmental groups and people who are impacted, right? And then on the opposite end, you have the CEO, right? So at the very, very top, we have the mayor. Now, the mayor is a little bit on the fence, right? So we're not really sure. So out of all of these people, who do you think the most likely target would be? And you would just upon somebody who both has the power to give you what you want and can be moved on a particular issue. So who do you think we might select in terms of the mayor? Or excuse me, oh man, the target. I'm like looking at the screen to see if I can see anyone's faces. The mayor, yeah. I messed it up. But yeah, and the voters might actually be, so for instance, you felt like the voters might be a good option as well, because the voters can really influence the mayor, right? So let's say the mayor was not on this issue, but you knew that the voters could apply influence. That might be a good opportunity to use the second kind of power map that we were just talking about. So strategy would be to get the mayor to move on the issue of fossil fuel investment and the banks that the city uses, right? So that's just one example. And now it's your turn. So if you have a pen and paper close by, go ahead and grab it. And what you're going to do, and you can try either kind of power map if you'd like to. If you want to actually just flip back to the other screen, Hannah, the one where, yeah, perfect. So you can take either kind of model, so either the one on the right or the left. Pick an issue that you care about, or maybe one that you're working on. And show and go ahead and map out, just like in the next 3 minutes, all the key players. So if you're on the right hand side, all the key players involved in that campaign, or if you're on the left hand side, who your decision maker is and the different influences around them. And I'm going to pause. And unfortunately, I don't have any snappy hold music, so you'll just have to bear with us in awkward silence. And Hannah, just so you know, while folks are practicing, I just got a text message asking the dial-in number for this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and answer that. Okay. Give it 30 more seconds. Start finishing up your thoughts. I know that was really, really fast. It's okay. Don't panic, Janice. Okay. So at this point, we're going to get a little bit creative because there's not a great way to share this out. But does someone want to share their power map and sort of like hold it up to the camera and walk us through it? Go ahead and take yourself off mute if you'd like to share. Or alternatively, if someone doesn't have, if you're not on video, you could go ahead and just share with the group who your decision maker was, and sort of like which format you decided to use, who your decision maker was, and kind of what the process was like for you. Would anyone like to share? Oh, awesome. So Lindsay's saying, I'm interested in getting recycling for the apartment buildings in my town. Awesome. So Lindsay, who can give you what you want in that particular initiative that you'd like to do? Like, who is the person that you decided, the key decision maker would be the director of environmental affairs. Perfect. Wonderful. So how did the process go? Did you use the map where you were like looking at all the different influences on the decision maker, or the one where you're mapping out all the different sort of factors in your campaign? Cool. Awesome. So what did you kind of come to the consensus of like, what was the thing that really sort of shifted the decision maker, or what things did the decision maker care about? Cool. So Lindsay's saying the decision maker would be, or excuse me, the decision in terms of financial, the decision maker might care about grants from the state recycling program. Awesome. So your strategy might be to dig up some grants, take those to your decision maker, and see if that might get your decision maker to shift. And the great thing about that particular plan is it doesn't necessarily, like, you might not necessarily need to take an action, right? So you're kind of starting with the first rung of engagement, or the easiest possible thing that you could do, and the thing that carries the least risk, and going with that before you have to sort of escalate or do something else to convince that person. Awesome. Do folks have any questions before we move on about power mapping or kind of like that process? Going once, going twice. Awesome. Cool. So we're going to move on. The thing about power mapping, as I just mentioned, is this is something that you could literally do for hours, right? This isn't something that's meant to be done in 3 minutes. And it's not really necessarily something that we can even, it sounds like Jewish Voice for Peace has definitely covered it in a webinar, so I might recommend them as a resource. But it's something that, again, could take up a whole webinar in and of itself, or a whole sort of like 2-day-long training in and of itself, because it's something, again, that is really used to sharpen your campaign strategy. And so it's something that deserves quite a bit of attention. So this is more of like a skim so that you can later go deeper. The other thing I want to talk about is something that can both help inform your strategy and your tactics. And that is called, I don't know if you could hear that, that was my drum roll, the points of intervention. And here on the screen, you can see Mariah Carey is going to shut all this shit down. Apologies for the expletives for those of you who might be sensitive to that. But Mariah Carey is going to do that for us. And I'm going to tell you how. So before I move on, I love Mariah Carey. I'm just gonna, yeah. Has anyone heard of points of intervention before, or is that something that kind of like rings a bell for y'all? No. Great. Awesome. Well, that's perfect. So points of intervention is kind of, again, it's one of those things where it's like, I'm going to throw out some definitions and use them as they are useful to you, but don't get hung up on the definitions because it's all just kind of like a way for us to be able to sharpen our campaign strategy versus like any sort of particular academic thing, right? But points of intervention, you can use them to mobilize your base into action, so make something happen. You can use it to intervene on a decision maker or your target. You can use it to identify where you should focus your campaign efforts. So is there a particular location or a particular issue that you should be sort of like narrowing in on? And this last one, you can use it to decide on a location for an action or an event. So it can be a good opportunity for you to sort of like figure out where you should host something and what makes the most strategic sense. Cool. So on your screen, you can see a star, right? And on the star, we're going to look at each different point of the star as a different point of intervention. Yes, exactly, in targeting an issue. Cool. So the different points of intervention are simply, so the different places are different sort of opportunities that you have to put yourself in between an injustice that's happening and the solution that you want. So the first one at the very top is production or destruction. So what do you think that might mean? Like, what might be the point of production or destruction? What do you think that means? What comes to mind when you hear that? Not sure if people aren't responding because, oh, I don't know. That's okay, Chris. No big deal. So I can never tell if people are typing. And so I want to pause for an extra long time, or if people are just like, I really don't know, Peter, you're talking nonsense. So the point of destruction is, for instance, where they're doing the bad thing. So in a campaign talking about forests, for instance, that might be where they are clear cutting old growth forest. In a fossil fuel campaign, that might be the frack site, right? Like that is where they're actively doing the thing. If you were looking at a boycott campaign or a campaign that shifts to sort of like, that seeks to shift personal choices, that might be the supermarket or the place where people are buying something, right? So that's one point. The other point, as you might imagine, is the point of consumption. So again, like taking like fossil fuels for an example, that might be the gas station, or it might even be, depending on how you look at it, it might even be the oil refinery. So the point of destruction, the point of consumption, the point of decision, which is oftentimes where a decision maker comes in, right? So the point of decision is, let's say, Congress is going to vote on something that pertains to your campaign. That would be the point of decision. But it doesn't just have to be about, it doesn't just have to be about the government or a legislative thing. It could also, for instance, be where a CEO is going to make a particular decision, or maybe there is a shareholders meeting or a board of directors meeting that you feel like there's going to be a decision that's made. That might be a good opportunity to intervene and to, persuade your decision maker to see your point of view. Okay. So the last 2 points on the star can get a little bit iffy and sometimes they're a little bit confusing. The first one is the point of potential. So when I say the point of potential, oftentimes what that forces us to do is to look at something in a new way. So instead of, for instance, having a mountaintop removal site, what if that was a site of wind energy or solar energy? Instead of having a landfill, what if that was a What if that was like a community recycling center or something that helps the community? So the point of potential is an opportunity to take the thing that you see that is harming your community and turn it into something that you think it could be. Maybe your decision maker hasn't seen it. Maybe even your community hasn't seen it. Another example that I like to use is, for instance, like the Black Panther Party and their free breakfast program, right? So they saw that the government was not going to help their community. And so what they chose to do was to demonstrate what could happen if you focus resources in a community in an equitable way through their free breakfast program. The last one, this is my favorite, and oftentimes the trickiest, the point of assumption. So the point of assumption is where, for instance, a lot of times this deals with like culture change or a campaign that seeks to sort of change people's minds about things versus like actually stopping a physical thing from happening. So that is where someone might assume something and you want to flip that on its head. I'm curious if folks have any thoughts about a particular example of when that might have happened. Sometimes where someone challenged your assumption. One example that I like to share with people, and this was before the presidential election, and actually before Hillary Clinton ran, but there was one person who started up a YouTube channel and produced a series of videos. And what she did was she's a woman, and she decided to create policy as though she was the president. And people would laugh and say, oh, haha, isn't that so nice that you would create policy as though you were the president? And she said, well, why is that so absurd that a woman would be president? Another one that I like was sort of targeting different sports mascots, which sort of like used racial slurs and depicted Indigenous people in particularly profane and offensive ways. And was using like an entire people as a mascot, right? And so what somebody did was they flipped that on its head and they said, well, what if white people were the mascot of particular football teams? And people said, well, that's impossible. That's ridiculous. And to that, the person said, why? So they were challenging the point of assumption. So I'm going to pause for a second and see if folks have any questions about any of the different points of intervention that I just talked about. Chris Ryan says, I am clear. Good. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and take that as a hint. So I just want to take an opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of the examples. And Lindsay is actually asking for another example of a point of potential. Before I give one, I'll actually just pause and see if anyone else would like to answer that question. Do you have an example of the point of potential that you can think of, or maybe something that you've seen in your community or in organizing? Cool. So one that I can think of in particular, and there's been a couple different campaigns that have focused on this at different times, but a lot of times in cities, there'll be like sort of like vacant lots, or there will be developers who like will buy up land and won't use it for anything. And meanwhile, oftentimes we also know in cities there's two different things. First of all, there's a lot of lack of homelessness, or a lack of housing for people, which results in homelessness and inequities in that way. Or there is a lack of access to like healthy food, right, in food deserts. And so I've seen people do two different things. So rather than just like let that empty lot sit there and sort of be both an eyesore and like a symbol of the inequity that exists, where some people have excess and some people have none, they have taken it over and turned it into a community garden. Or sometimes they've built entire encampments of folks where people who are experiencing houselessness can go, they can camp, they can feel safe, they can be together. And it really causes everyone to think like, well, what would the world look like if we actually provided for people? Other times people have actually occupied buildings, for instance. They have taken a building that is sat vacant, and they have turned it into a community resource center for people, where people can find access on more permanent housing. They can find job access, things like that. And it goes from like being something that's empty and excessive to being something that's really for the community. Chris Ryan says, phosphate landfill was converted into a wildlife refuge. Yes, that's a perfect example of the point of potential. So taking something that is currently used for destructive purposes and flipping it and saying, what if it was something that actually was useful for us? Great. Someone was saying this is useful because they've never seen it before. So I'm going to run through just a couple examples, and I'm actually going to use our Summer of Resistance as a perfect opportunity. Oh, wonderful. So once again, here's the the definitions. I didn't even need the definitions, y'all. I knew it. Cool. So a couple examples. So for instance, I think the fossil fuel banks that fund fossil fuel projects is a perfect example. For instance, this past year and in years before that as well, folks would show up at shareholder meetings and apply pressure to different sort of like oil companies or companies that were investing their money in fossil fuels. And that was a point of decision, right? Actually, can you back it up one slide? I'm sorry, Hannah. Thank you. In the past, people have picketed different gas stations where people were purchasing gas from a particular company, for instance, like Shell, or an example where folks have picketed different stores where people were selling, for instance, like old growth timber, right, at Home Depot. Yeah, Maria is saying divestment, bantering, and picketing, and things like that. Folks have actively reclaimed different sites where fracking was happening or where mountaintop removal was happening. So that could be either production destruction or the point of assumption. Sorry, my light is flickering. And before we move on again, I just want to open it up to folks to see if you have any other potential examples of ways that all 5 points of the intervention might be used. Going once? Going twice? Cool. And again, these are not like hard and fast definitions, right? Like these are definitely things that that are meant to be sort of like developed into like a personal definition that you have, right? Lindsay's asking, can assumption, the point of assumption be used in animal welfare campaigns? Absolutely. I think sometimes, like for instance, people have challenged the assumption that fur is a really cool thing to wear. So folks who are campaigning against animals being used for fur products, they have like sort of like challenged the notion like, well, why would you wear someone's skin? That's really weird. I think also just like, you know, challenging the cultural assumption of meat to be healthy, or, you know, that meat is like essentially something that like your body absolutely has to have. And I think one thing that's complicated about the point of assumption is it really relies upon a cultural norm. And as we know, cultural norms are not always the same for every culture, right? So that's really something, I think particularly with the point of assumption, but with all of these different things and with all of your different campaigns, it's really important to think about like how might different cultures or just cultures different from me personally receive this? How might this not play out or play out really well in a particular culture? And I think, you know, animal rights issues is a perfect example of that, where like it has different cultural meaning depending upon where you are and what community you're in. And so it's really important to think about which audience you're speaking to with it. Cool. And I'll just take one more question before we move on. So are these parts of every campaign, or are these different points that campaigns can be built around individually? That is a fantastic question. I love it. So most campaigns focus on one or at most 2 points of intervention. The reason why is because creating a campaign strategy is all about narrowing down the different choices that you have to be able to go after something. Because just like there's so many different issues in our world, unfortunately, there are also so many different ways that we can go about solving it, right? And so many different sort of creative ways that we can make change, right? So the point of intervention is really just looking at which one is most strategic for you at this point. That was not supposed to be a pun, but it was. At this moment, I should say. Which one is most strategic for you at this moment? And it doesn't have to be something that you stick with the whole time. So if your campaign decides that you are going to pick the point of destruction and you are going to stage an action on a frac site, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't then go and show up at a meeting where people are going to be deciding about land use and whether or not to allow more frac sites in your community, right? Like you can use both of them. So so I suppose the answer is an action should ideally focus on one, but your campaign, you can kind of switch it up a little bit. But yeah, it's really just meant to help you sort of like hone and sort of narrow down what different types of things you're going to be doing in your campaign. Great. I'm glad that made sense. I realized I was kind of contradicting myself in the middle of that answer. So cool. So I'm actually going to toss it over to Hannah to sort of like help start closing us out and talk about different steps that we can take to actually apply some of these different things.
Okay, sorry folks, I had a hard time unmuting myself. Great, so yeah, thank you so much, Peter. I learned a lot from that, so yeah, I really enjoyed that. So now I wanted to talk to you all about something that we're doing called the Summer of Resistance. And so I'm sure a lot of y'all have actually heard of it. Do I have any people who are hosts or volunteering in some other capacity right now on the call? I can't access the chat. Peter, can you look at it?
I'm sorry. I was chatting while you were chatting.
Oh, okay. No worries. Because I think we do have some hosts on the call right now, which is really exciting. And so, awesome. Yay. Welcome. And if you're not a host yet, it is not too late. You can become one. So let me tell you all more about the project. So Summer of Resistance is what Greenpeace is doing this summer to train hundreds of activists across the country in nonviolent direct action, which includes peaceful protests and creative communication. And so we're doing this through, we launched a webinar last weekend on the 25th. You can actually still check it out. It's on Greenpeace USA's Facebook page. It's just a 30-minute long nonviolent direct action overview. And then we also have a series of in-person trainings that are happening all around the country. And you can find that on summerofresistance.org, which Peter, if you could drop that link in the chat, that would be awesome. Thank you. And so you can just go on summerofresistance.org, type in your zip code, and then you can find out if there is an in-person nonviolent direct action training happening in your community, or there are also distributed events or events led by volunteers all across the country happening. And we're in the process of helping hosts get their events posted on the website. So like I said, if you want to type in your zip code and see if there is some kind of action or training happening near you, you can learn about how to get involved. This is a really exciting opportunity right now for the summer, and we need as much help as possible. This is just a really crucial moment. And so you can also, oh, there we go. Okay, so I believe that you all will get the slides. I'm going to follow up email. So you can go ahead and click on these links when you get the slides. So you can watch the webcast, you can read the resources. If there isn't an event already happening, you can actually host your own. We have a team ready to support you in your action, and we also have a team of really experienced activists who are also willing to answer any questions that you have, and help you with the planning and facilitation of your action. So we can connect you to one of those summer of resistance leaders. I know that they're really excited to get involved and start meeting other volunteers. And then planning with others, just really getting together with your community, if that's like your family, your friends, your neighbors. And yeah, just going on summerofresistance.org and finding out how you can get involved this summer. You can also, we have a lot of ways you can get involved. You can also start or find a local group on Greenwire. So Greenpeace Greenwire, it's kind of like Facebook, but for Greenpeace activists. I'm on it every single day, so please say hi. And it's a great way to connect with other Greenpeace volunteers in your area. You can find other groups, other volunteering opportunities, events. We have some really great blog posts and content on the website. So yeah, you can create an account and start connecting with other people either in your town or in your region. We have groups for both. So it's a great way to meet other activists.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah.
Sure.
Cool. So I'm just going to skip ahead to our last slide. Awesome. So we've covered quite a bit of ground tonight, and we've gone again we've just skimmed the surface on a couple of really, really important concepts. So after this, we're going to be emailing out to you this particular slide presentation. And I'm also going to pause for just a moment and see if folks have any more questions. While we're sort of like waiting for folks to ask questions or get answered questions, I'm going to drop something very, very important to me in the chat box, and that is the feedback form. So the feedback form is basically how we can tell that we are either sort of like meeting the needs of our activist community or not. And so it's really important that we get that feedback from you. It is anonymous. However, if you want to stay in touch and you want to be followed up with, that's totally great. And you can give us your name and email. So give me just 1 second. I'm going to drop that in the chat box. Sorry, y'all, having some technical difficulties. Oh my goodness, there we go. Apologies. So in the chat box, you can see this particular feedback form. So please feel free to give us any information, including the technical difficulties just really messed up my ability to learn. So do you folks have any other questions, thoughts, or concerns? I see Chris saying, it was a very informative webinar. I'm super glad. Getting a thank you from Chris. Okay, going once, going twice, perfect. Okay, so just to close out our call in a more official way, I'd love to hear how you're going to use this information in the future. Are you going to use it to host a Summer of Resistance event? Are you going to use it to think about more strategic ways to build your campaigns? Is there a campaign you're working on? How are you going to use this event in the future? Or this information, rather, in the future? Chris, I'm not going to repeat that on a recorded webinar. But yes, ramp up resistance. helping to build strategic campaigns in the Summer of Resistance, but really, really good. I'm glad. Using power mapping and points of intervention when writing to local state government about various environmental issues. Absolutely. Knowing what speaks to your stakeholder, or excuse me, your decision maker is a really important thing. And I see some people sharing support for Chris's controversial suggestion. Cool. I'll give folks 10 more seconds to share. No, it's okay, Chris. Okay, cool. Well, if no one else has any other ideas that they'd like to share, I'm going to go ahead and close out. Again, I'm going to just drop one more time that link into the chat so that you can oh, Bobby says, I'll be using this information to put our campaign together among those who are impacted in many ways by reductions to our national parks. Thank you, Bobby. Cool. So the feedback form is right there. Go ahead and click on it before I close out of the Zoom chat. Otherwise, there will be opportunities to look out for more opportunities to attend different webinars like this, including in just a couple weeks in your email inbox. Okay. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a good night.
Thank you all. And I hope to see you on summerofresistance.org.